into the countryside and try to keep the militia, that was encouraged, by the way, by the Continental Congress, from arming themselves. And so they had a system of alarm riders, and the most famous is Paul Revere and his Midnight Ride. But there was William Dawes and Dr. Prescott, and they would ride out into the countryside and let people know if the British were coming. And sure enough, the British were coming one night, and they ended up at Lexington and Concord on April 19th, 1775, where the American Revolution began. And essentially, the British were looking for stored munitions, okay, those are guns, that the militia would use. And essentially, in Lexington and Concord, they had heard about these munitions. They also heard that Sam Adams and John Hancock were in Lexington. And because of that, it made those, the British, they headed out to those places where their targets were at. They wanted to go and track down John Hancock and Sam Adams. These guys were problem makers, and they were revolutionaries, and in a time period when the revolution hadn't even started. And so they figured if they could get these guys, then they would be able to stop things. And that's what General Gage, with his 700 troops, went and did. And sure enough, on the morning of April 19th, the 700 men that General Gage took out into the British country, or the Massachusetts countryside, ran into 77 Minutemen on the greens of Lexington. And it would be here where a shot would be fired, and it helped start a war. And that shot that was fired, no one knows who actually fired it. It's kind of a mystery, but it wouldn't matter. It would go down in history after being written down in a poem called the Hymn of Concord, "The Shot Heard Round the World," and that was Ralph Waldo Emerson who said that in the 1830s. But the most important element is what happened at Lexington started the revolution for the people of New England and Massachusetts, and eventually for the whole country. A month later, the event that often gets overshadowed is the necessity of having weaponry. And at Fort Ticonderoga, in north, heading towards Canada, just off Lake Champlain, there is a fort that is pretty much the last barrier for the British before it drops into the American territory on the other side of the Proclamation Line. And it would be here at Fort Ticonderoga where Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, along with Benedict Arnold, would surprise the British. That's not a gun he's holding, that's a light. It's a candle. He basically opens a door and he's completely caught off guard, because these people who were in Fort Ticonderoga were a long ways away from where Lexington and Concord took place. And because of that, they had no idea that they were at war with the Americans. And so we surprised the British. They didn't know we were at war. And sure enough, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, who would eventually become a colonel in the Continental Army and the most famous trader in American history, are able to take this fort. And what they captured was the most important thing. There were 50 plus heavy artillery weaponry there. It was a fort. It was designed to house and take care of the weapons needed to defend the frontier. And so taking this fort was absolutely essential for the Americans to have resources that they would need. Henry Knox will be the one that is tasked with getting these cannons where they need to go and do the most damage, which is outside of the surrounding areas of Boston. But we will come back to that. But I do want you to remember Henry Knox. Okay, we call him the jolly old fat man, and Henry Knox is awesome. We honor him today for his duty and serving in our country's military, and as he ends up becoming a very important figure in our first cabinet under Washington. And Henry Knox Fort Knox is named after him. The guy was a genius, and he did a great job getting those cannons and taking care of the process of helping us to fight this war. Now, the Second Continental Congress, after Lexington and Concord, decides to meet again. I showed you that on the film John Adams, Independence, the second film. That's where we kind of picked up at, was when he returns to the Continental Congress, and they still do not understand that this is a war, that we are in a fight. And they basically send the king a final petition, okay, called the Olive Branch Petition. While that's going on, General Gage is reinforced with the actual general of the entire British Army, and his name is William Howe. Now, General Howe comes to Boston, and when he gets there, he basically has a target in mind of what he wants to do to make a point to the Americans. Remember, Boston's on this peninsula, and it's surrounded by water. Well, there's other peninsulas nearby that he wants to make sure he has control of. And basically, the Americans dig in overnight, and they build up their fortifications. And they're on top of these hills. Now, pretty much in modern-day warfare and even past warfare, the best thing you can do for yourself to defend yourself is to be on the high ground. Okay, being low and trying to climb uphill is always difficult. And so this is a view from the American fortifications on top of Breed's Hill. Most of the fighting took place on Breed's Hill, yet it's most well known as Bunker Hill. And you can see out here in the distance, you can see that this is Boston. So let's take a look of the process of the British. When they attack, this is their formations. They're all about intimidation. They wear these bright red uniforms to strike fear into their opponents. Everything is done according to a perfect order, and that's how they roll. And they marched straight up that hill, and they were taken out one by one. And by the time they got to the top of that hill, chaos ensued, and they were able to overwhelm the undermanned militia. Now remember, the militia is just a bunch of volunteers. They're an army that is made up of volunteers that aren't really professional soldiers, and they're not supported by any government. So these people are just defending their homes, their country, the stuff that they care about, and they're going to pay the ultimate price for it. And like I said, the key component is the battles took place on Bunker and Breed's Hill. The colonists would dig trenches overnight and set up their fortifications. General Howe's British soldiers attacked the hills straight uphill, like I showed, and the Americans were given orders: don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. And that was important because they needed every bullet to count. Every one of the musket balls needed to hit its mark, because the reason that the British would actually win this battle, which they did, was because the Americans ran out of ammunition. They ran out of the resources they need to fight this battle. So you can see here, the Americans did lose, but it is known as a moral victory. Over 1,000 dead British soldiers. Only 441 Americans died. This was the first major battle of the American Revolution. Okay, the shot heard round the world started the war, but this was the first battle of the Revolution. And it was a moral victory for the Americans. They stood up against the greatest military power in the world, and they only lost because they ran out of resources. Now, in the meantime, the Second Continental Congress comes together, and they're dealing with all sorts of issues, and the Second Continental Congress they're going to have to make a decision, and that is to support this war. Unfortunately, they're waiting on the Olive Branch petition before they do anything. And what's the king do? King George III, he doesn't even care. He doesn't even read the Olive Branch petition because it came from, in his mind, an illegal assembly of men that were causing revolt in America. He outlawed colonial assemblies, and these men sent him a letter from a unified colonial assembly. So why would he even read it? In response, he replies back with his own proclamation. And it essentially, you can't read the fine print there, it's kind of small, but he calls them rebels that are committing sedition and that are treasonous, and that they will all be hung. And in the film that you saw, Ben Franklin kind of laughs about this because it's the one thing that the king does that unifies the colonists more than anything else. And the statement that he made is classic. I love it. And he says, well, the best part is we're all going to die, so we're all going to either hang individually or we can hang together. And sorry, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that was the idea. It unified the colonies. And before this event, even after Bunker Hill, they were not unified. Now, shortly after Bunker Hill, because the events at Bunker Hill occurred, the Continental Army would be finally adopted by the Continental Congress, and it would be John Adams who would come forth, obviously with with a little bit of helpful nudge from Ben Franklin, who had recommended you have to have the largest colony support. So John Adams chose to nominate George Washington as the general of this newly formed Continental Army. And the reason that was important was because of the fact that he was a Virginian. That is everything. You have to have a leader that brings in the southern colonies. If the South is not involved, then this becomes a New England war. And if it's a New England war, then it's going to fail. It's going to definitely cause problems. Which leads us to the next event.